Ladies and gentlemen,
That was really cool. That was probably cheaper.
finish your conversations, put away your cheeseburgers, and pay attention.
We only eat in your pants.
We have a start on time.
That's not allowed. Excuse me, I'm not sure that's allowed.
That's the new regime. Well, our first talk is Mark Norman on Scooby Doo. He will explain everything about snacks and petty kids and folklore. So, ladies and gentlemen, put it together for Mark Norman.
This is the equivalent of the Armadacon graveyard shift, where it's the first talk of the day rather than the one after lunch. Expect me to drift in as we go. So, yes, as Dave says, folklore and horror in the Scooby Doo universe. This is indeed a talk about everybody's favourite dog-human mystery-solving outfit that isn't Goober and the Ghost Chasers.
What's it about?
You'll find out. So what I want to talk about is how the writers of Scooby Doo draw on and in turn influence our own folklore and mythology in the real world in terms of kind of horror tropes and stories and things like that. This talk is based on a book that I am writing on this subject. For those that have asked if it's available, no, it comes out next year. I'm still writing it at the moment. But I've been very fortunate to be able to chat with and interview quite a few of the writers and showrunners from different iterations of the programme over the years to try and get some insight into how they've constructed the characters and things like that. So, as a writer, it was important to me to give the writers of the show a voice in this whole thing, and that's kind of what's going to be in the book, amongst other things, I hope. But first, before we start, a content warning. All good talks give a content warning in case you get triggered before we get too far into the talk. I'll try and avoid it as much as I can, but at some point it's inevitable. I'm sorry. Interestingly, some of the writers, more than one, but particularly John Semper, who was the creator of the animated Spider-Man series and also was a writer on some of the older versions of Scooby and Scrappy, for him, that's the strongest character in the whole thing. I'll leave it to later to tell you why if you're interested in that. Okay. So, let's kick off. Here's the premise for those that don't know it, or a reminder for those that do. A building or a person or a community is being terrorised by something that is not of this world. It might be a ghost, it might be a monster, it might just be something very strange. It might be connected to an age-old legend, or it might be something to do with that old recluse who lives up in the castle. It could have come from space, or it could have come from another dimension. Or maybe it might just be the creepy old fairground owner covering up some nefarious deed that he's committed under the cover of darkness. And he would have gotten away with it too, if it wasn't for those meddling kids and their talking dog. And sometimes, bizarrely, Laurel and Hardy. Or Ricky Gervais. That probably also should have gone in the content warning. Probably should move him. Fred, Daphne, Velma, Shaggy and obviously Scooby Doo have been investigating spooky goings-on for nigh over 50 years now. And, let's be honest, they look pretty good on it too. I guess all that running around is probably good for their health. So from its debut in 1969, through to the present day, the Scooby Doo franchise in all of its various iterations has drawn very heavily on real-world legend and real-world folklore. So from the very beginning, Season 1, Episode 1, the Black Knight's armour miraculously comes to life, right through to more modern iterations and concepts such as those surrounding the Nibiru cataclysm in 2012's Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated. Many of the show's stories have referenced or directly deal with our own folklore from all around the globe. And there's a lot of shows to do that. So, I have a spreadsheet. Don't you?
Yes, you do.
I have a spreadsheet
He does have a spreadsheet.
of every episode and film and TV movie in order from 1969 through to the present day, with titles and villains and notes on the folklore and the plot. And that spreadsheet is well over 500 rows. Don't judge, it's for research purposes.
Allegedly.
It's colour-coded.
We're not judging. Oh,
It's colour-coded and everything. No, I know. I have to do that because some are notoriously difficult to find in the UK now, and I have to try and watch as many of them as possible in order to do justice to the book. What that means, though, in terms of this talk, obviously, is that we can only cover a few bits and pieces from this very broad canon. So what I'm going to try and do is look at common themes and see how the programme treats them, what actual folklore might be being drawn on, and sometimes where it does it very well, and sometimes where it just gets it very annoyingly wrong for no particularly good reason. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the urban myths that surround Scooby Doo. Because Scooby Doo also has had an influence on urban myths within our own culture as well. Scooby Doo, Where Are You?, the grammatically appalling original series, came from the Hanna-Barbera stable as a result of pressure from parent groups in America in 1968. So the group ACT, Action for Children's Television, think kind of Mary Whitehouse for kids shows, okay, they were particularly concerned about the levels of perceived violence that were part of Saturday morning kids' TV at that time in the States. And protests by this group led to a large number of shows, and many of those shows came from the Hanna-Barbera stable, being cancelled. So there was a need for new, more wholesome content. Members of pressure groups, in fact, went on to advise Hanna-Barbera on the generation of these new ideas. There was still a recognition that children wanted adventure, or mystery, or excitement in these shows, and Scooby Doo was a more kind of action for children's television friendly version of that sort of concept. Now, we can't go through all the details of the show, that would take too long. Some of the stories are probably true. I always used to say at this point, some of the stories are true, like the origin of Scooby's name, okay, which is supposedly from the scat singing of Frank Sinatra, okay, which was, according to Fred Silverman, who was the exec at the time, where the inspiration came from. Mitch Watson, the showrunner on Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated, tells me that in fact Hanna-Barbera had a character called Scooby in the archives prior to that. That was Scooby the Seal, and possibly the name actually originally comes from there. I think that Fred Silverman wrote a lot of himself into the mythos of the show. I think it's no coincidence that the lead character is called Fred, for example. That's just my opinion. But what definitely is true is that the characters are based on a teen sitcom that was running in America at the time. Okay, The Many Lives of Dobie Gillis. So here's a comparison. For those who like to play like cats, there's the cat toy. Okay. Here's a comparison. One blonde, all-American athlete. Okay. One pretty, popular, preppy girl. One hippie with a goatee beard. And one intelligent girl. All very stereotypical. Okay. All that's missing is, obviously, the dog. The dog goes much further back in time than The Many Lives of Dobie Gillis. Okay? There we are, 4th century BCE, Greek mug, Scooby mug, very similar. Now there's a persistent myth that the 5 main characters in this show are designed to represent the 5 colleges from the consortium of colleges that make up the Connecticut River Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts. Okay, 5 university campuses, if you like. The idea behind this story is that the traits of these 5 characters are said to sum up the different typical students that you get in these 5 places. Amherst College, preppy students. So Fred, sporty student, is supposed to be related to Amherst College. The thin, upper-class Daphne, Mount Holyoke. Scooby, the lovable party animal, is associated with the University of Massachusetts. Velma, the nerdy book lover, is associated with Smith College. And Shaggy, the beatnik, is associated with Hampshire College. This story has been running for a long time. It is completely not true. There are a couple of particular clues that can lead you to this assumption. Firstly, the show first aired in 1969. Hampshire College didn't open until 1970. That's a clue. And secondly, because the late Io Takamoto, the animator who designed the characters, debunked the rumour in his autobiography. Because of his ignorance of the American college system, he wrote, "There is no truth in it, this story. In fact, until all this came up, I don't think I could have named 5 colleges in the Boston area, let alone been familiar enough with them to copy their style. Besides, the Scooby Gang are high school kids, not college kids." And actually, it's worth noting that only 4 of them, of course, are high school age. Scooby, according to the official notes that accompany the 2012 movie, is 7, which would put him in primary school. Or alternatively, in human years, 49, which I guess is some kind of adult education evening class. While we're talking about Scooby for a moment, let's think about his design. Scooby Doo is an anthropomorphic Great Dane. He represents the antithesis of everything that a Great Dane is, in terms of his anatomy, but also in terms of representations of the Great Dane as a dog within folklore and legend. So when it came to drawing the character of Scooby, Takamoto spoke to breeders of Great Danes to learn what features represented them best. And then he drew the exact opposite of all of those features. So Scooby has bow legs. He has a weak backbone, which is very much summing up his outlook on everything around him in the stories. Actual Great Danes are known for their tall physical stature. Scooby is usually hunched or cowering. They were originally bred as hunting dogs. Scooby obviously runs away from everything instead of pursuing it. And in terms of folklore, it was thought that Great Danes were able to ward off nightmares and ghosts and evil spirits. And it's unlikely that that happened by being scared of them. What Scooby has done, though, is he's added an element of language to our own language because of his unique pattern of speech. Now, we all know that Scooby has this habit of adding extra R's to his words. That, as a phonological disorder, is completely invented. But there is some basis in language that this sits on. R-like sounds in phonetics are called rhotic consonants. And they're difficult to describe, but in different languages, they're things like rolled R's or guttural R's. Okay? There's an accepted speech condition known as rhoticism, where one consonant is changed to a rhotic consonant in a particular situation. So Cilla Black's Liverpool dialect, for example, is a good example of that. So changing lot of to Laura, that's an example of changing into a rhotic consonant. Scooby does that sometimes as well, because he obviously pronounces Shaggy's name as Raggy. But where it's invented is with the addition of an R sound, as in Rutrow. Okay? Scooby is the only creature that we know of, human or otherwise, who exhibits this particular speech disorder. But in 2014, Stephen Long of Marquette University's Speech Pathology and Audiology Department diagnosed Scooby-Doo's condition of a speech impediment and termed it rhotic replacement. So there now is, in our own culture, a disorder named in the real world by experts that is exhibited by one dog. As humans, interestingly, we tend to subtract sounds from patterns of speech when we have an impediment and not add sounds to them. So children, for example, tend to de-roticize their speech, the opposite of Scooby Doo. They will drop the R sound. And some adults do that too. Be very, very quiet. Now the reason that the 5 colleges myth sticks around is because the characters seem to resonate with people. If you stop for a minute to consider why that is, you'll realise that actually these characters are stereotypes that you're very familiar with in other ways. Mystery Incorporated is based on a sitcom, and those are stereotypical sitcom characters: the leader, the brainy one, the attractive one, and the bungling comedy sidekick. But go back even further into comedic history. Around 50 years or so is plenty, but you can go back much further than that, and you get this, the Commedia dell'arte. Il Capitino, the self-appointed leader. Innamoratori, the upper-class lovers, represented by Daphne, because these are lovers of other people and of themselves, and in some iterations of the story, Daphne is very much like that. Vecchi, the scholarly, sensible characters, and the Zani, the clowns. Very familiar, isn't it? These character themes are hardwired into Western storytelling, so you recognise them instantly and you associate yourself with them without even thinking about it. You become part of the gang, if you like. Now, I did wonder whether this isn't a knowing nod to this in Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated, whether there isn't a knowing nod to it. Season 2, episode 12 of Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated is called The Shrieking Madness. It's an episode which characterises a very famous writer in terms of parody with Professor Hatecraft. Now, as part of that episode, the gang visit Darrow University fraternities and they compare them to each other. Maybe this is the 5 college consortium myth being represented in the show, I thought, so I asked the writer. And apparently it's not. But there are some other urban myths about the characters in Scooby Doo which have been subsequently taken up and run with within the show, both as a nod to the original myth amongst ourselves and to kind of adopt this myth and turn it into something canonical for later. One of these is very, very obvious, gets vehemently denied by the creators, and that is this. The drug references to Shaggy were obviously never intended in the show, but it's very easy to see how they came about. Scooby and Shaggy constantly have the munchies, right? Shaggy has the look and the vocal pattern and the general demeanour of somebody with more than a little weed in their back pocket. Scooby and Shaggy, for that matter, both have an effect not unlike getting high from eating Scooby snacks, their own personal hash brownie food. They constantly crave them, they do anything for them, and they become very compliant when they've eaten them. Later episodes take this myth and have some fun with it. The first live-action movie has an early scene with the Mystery Machine being parked at the beach. Smoke escapes from the sunroof and groaning voices are heard inside. "Talk about toasted," says Shaggy. Him and Scooby are cooking burgers in the back of the van, but it's obvious that that's not what you're supposed to think. In another scene, he sits next to a blonde girl on an aeroplane. Shaggy learns that they both love Scooby snacks. He asks her name and she tells him it's Mary Jane, and he's like, "Oh, like that's my favourite name." Scrappy's obviously on speed. There were other references to mythological stereotypes filmed for this movie, but ultimately they were dropped in favour of a PG certificate. Fred originally went into Daphne's bedroom to protect her overnight and took a toothbrush with him. That scene was cut. And there was a comedic kiss between Daphne and Velma. That also didn't make it into the final cut of the movie. But Velma's sexuality is another piece of folklore which has made it into some versions. Until recently, it was always speculated that Velma was a lesbian, but it was never explicitly stated. There is arguably some queer coding in earlier episodes of the show. There are also some things which were taken as queer coding by some people, but very likely weren't, such as that one. Nothing stated for definite. However, both the writer of the live-action Scooby Doo movie and the producer of Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated have both come out recently and said it was their intention for Velma to be gay. In the case of the film, scenes were scripted and shot, but the studio removed most of them and watered the rest down. By the second live-action movie, Velma had a boyfriend. Now, while it's true that in Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated, Velma did go out with Shaggy for a while, that storyline was, according to the showrunner, intended to show that she wasn't happy with that type of relationship and she was trying to work out what was right for her. Her later story arc with Marcy, who's known as Hot Dog Water in the show, was the one in which Velma was the most comfortable. And season 2 ends with Marcy saying of Velma in episode 25, at the end of the culmination of everything, "That's my girl." And that was specifically the intention. In the latest iteration, which has just come out a couple of weeks ago, Trick or Treat, which is the latest Scooby-Doo movie, Velma does have a relationship with another female character, and it finally, undoubtedly, canonises that part. Now, there are other influences on pop culture, phrases from the show. Okay? Maybelline Kids, Jeepers, Zoinks and Jinkies are all found in common use now, although Professor Hatecraft does explicitly state in Mystery Incorporated that Jinkies is not a real word. But we probably ought to move on to talk a little bit more about the atmosphere of the show, because that's a whole different description. I can tell you where all of those phrases come from. Ask me later if you want to know. Some of the supernatural elements in the show. Now, we could note here that it's covered urban myths as well. There's an episode called Scare Bear, which has a werewolf with red eyes that makes me think of the myth of drop bears that come out of trees in Australia, for example. They look very similar. There's another one with very large crocodiles that makes me think of the crocodile in the sewer legend. But there can be no doubt that from the very first episode, Scooby Doo has placed one foot, at least very firmly, in the camp of the Gothic. Later episodes have taken the show elsewhere, but recently, Scooby Doo and Guess Who, which is the one with all the bizarre guest stars, has very much gone back to the original roots of Season 1, Episode 1. The castle and bats approach, if you like. In fact, their theme music and their opening titles start in the same way. Scooby Doo utilises the Gothic in a number of different ways, and design is a very obvious one. Haunted mansions, crumbling castles, creepy forests, they're all over the place. Whether the gang is out and about at home, whether that home is either Coolsville, as it is in many series, or Crystal Cove, the hauntedest place on Earth, as it is in Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated, some things remain the same. And somebody was talking about this last night, in fact. A thunderstorm could be along at any time. It's often a dark and stormy night, as David was talking about last night. In Season 1, Episode 11, a gaggle of galloping ghosts, a lightning bolt strikes Frankencastle, even though there isn't a single cloud in the sky. And the moon is always full. In mythology and folklore, and in the Gothic, the full moon carries a lot of significance. Hippocrates linked the moon to madness. One who is seized with terror, fright and madness during the night is visited by the goddess of the moon, he wrote. In the last 100 years or so, this fictional link has been made between the full moon and the werewolf. It doesn't go back any earlier than that, it's a later addition. Scientifically, the moon has an effect on many aspects of our planet. There's a lot to link it with the horrific. The moon is an important part in the cycle of death and rebirth, and that's represented in the Gothic ways in Scooby Doo as well. In classic designs of Scooby Doo, death as a concept is always very much on the periphery of the programme. Sometimes that's an obvious way, an animated corpse or a haunting, but sometimes it's in more subtle ways as well. Buildings are generally run down, even in towns. Woodwork is rotten. As with the Gothic generally, and a lot of folklore in particular, The haunted landscape has a kind of feel of death about it too. Trees are often twisted and leafless, dead leaves blow along the ground instead. Even in episodes which are set in totally different countries, you get the same feel. The remoteness of the mountains in episodes which feature the abominable snowman, for example. All of these stereotypical Gothic elements serve to codify for the viewer the evil villain or the supernatural event which we have come to expect is going to come along. The makeup of the show uses some accepted and discussed theories, in fact, within the Gothic as a part of this. So in the landscape, we can see at work Edmund Burke's theory of the sublime. Our awe for nature only comes along with an underlying horror at its beauty. It's the kind of feeling that you get if you stand on the top of a very high cliff or a raging waterfall or something like that. We can also argue that Scooby Doo also demonstrates Todorov's theory of the fantastic. Now, Todorov argued that the fantastic, as a term, sits between two camps, the uncanny and the marvellous. The uncanny is characterised by a character's response towards something unexplained, and usually that response is fear. The marvellous signifies that an amazing event has occurred which warrants no response at all from a character. It's just something amazing, and the fantastic sits in the middle between those two. It's that moment of hesitation between belief in something and disbelief in something. So whereas the uncanny is the explanation of the supernatural and the marvellous is the supernatural as supernatural, Scooby Doo transits this path from one end to the other, and it passes through that tipping point, usually between belief and disbelief. We watch the characters believe something is supernatural and then explain it. It's worth noting as well, though, that there are rare episodes which represent the marvellous, that's the supernatural as genuinely supernatural. They're not very frequent, and they're outside of the remit of the original construction of the series. A lot of them feature him. But what about the common folklore and horror characters? How are they represented? In essence, the results are a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes things are done purely for plot advancement or entertainment, and they bear no resemblance at all to any kind of creature or monster or concept within the real world. Sometimes they're completely stereotypical. Sometimes they go very well, and then something derails them along the way. So I'm going to take one concept to kind of explain this in all of its different forms, because that's all we've got time to do. And the concept that I'm going to use, because it comes up quite often, is the concept of the witch. Because that spans this whole range of ideas, so it's a good case study. And we don't have to wait very long for one to come along. Season 1, episode 2, in fact, this one with Captain Cutler, is the first example. The ghost of Captain Cutler. Bizarre witchcraft practices are taking place at the lighthouse, where Mrs. Cutler says that she's raised the ghost of Captain Cutler. She's stereotypical looking and sounding as a witch in every sense. She's got the hooked nose, she's got the cackling laugh, but obviously nothing of the kind has happened. In fact, Captain Cutler has faked his own death so that he can merrily go on with stealing yachts from Rocky Point Beach. And he would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for... No, Shaggy. Just Shaggy. As a sidebar, the character of Captain Cutler is interesting himself in many ways. He's unique in the whole thing as a villain. He's the only character who's ever disguised himself as a ghost of himself. This is also the only time that Shaggy discovers the identity of a villain before Velma does. And Captain Cutler also appears in other places too. Aside from being part of the classic title sequence, he's a statue which comes to life in the live-action sequel, Scooby Doo Monsters Unleashed, and his costume is also part of the Crystal Cove Spook Museum, which is owned by Velma's parents in Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated. The Spook Museum is absolutely brilliant. Imagine the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle as a resource for investigating mysteries, and that's what you get at the Spook Museum. Velma's mum has quite a useful occult library, which is out the back and which they consult from time to time. And there's also this brilliant set piece where they walk past a statue to Scrappy. Daphne tries to talk about it, but Fred cuts her off and reminds her that they all vowed they would never talk about that. Technically, the next appearance of a witch in Scooby Doo is the original 1969 season 1 of Scooby Doo, Where Are You? Again, episode 9, Puppet Master. The plot centres around a counterfeiting operation which is being run out of a theatre. The Puppet Master is a theatre ghost, a little bit like the Phantom of the Opera, and this accounts for the haunting. As well as a creepy clown and a jack-in-the-box as puppets, there's also a scary witch puppet. But for the next proper appearance of a witch character, 4 more episodes later, season 1, episode 13, Which Witch is Which? The gang get lost in a swamp. As you do, they ask a bystander for directions. And the bystander ends up being a zombie. Because reasons. He's been brought to life by a witch. So there's an interesting mix of stereotypes in this episode. The witch is the classical European stereotype to look at, but she uses voodoo magic to raise a zombie. The next time we see a witch, there is another real mix of stereotypes and real-world folklore and artistic license. And that comes from the 3rd and final series of Scooby Doo, Where Are You?, which was originally broadcast as part of another series, Scooby's All-Stars, and was later rebranded. In the UK, you might not know this one very well. It's never been released in DVD form in the UK. It was very rarely broadcast. I had to have a friend in the States go and buy an American version DVD and ship it over to me so that I could convert it and watch it for this research. Episode 4, To Switch a Witch, is the interesting one in terms of folklore. The monster of this piece is the Ghost Witch of Old Salem. So we have a witch, but she appears as a ghost. The episode has a number of solid folklore tropes, but they're mixed together in an odd way. And the history is where the artistic license comes in at this point. The character of the witch is Melissa Wilcox, who was said in the show to have been a witch at Salem who was burned at the stake 200 years ago. Most of you will instantly realise that there are 2 main problems here. Firstly, nobody who was executed as part of the Salem witch trials was burned. I could see Tracy frowning while I said that at that point. Anyway, 14 women and 5 men were executed by hanging, and 1 was pressed for refusing to plead. Giles Corey, if you're a fan of the Crucible. And a number of them died in jail. But secondly, the trials took place between 1692 and 1693, so the maths is out by about a century. Once again, all of the witches shown in this episode are, as you would expect at the time, stereotypical European hags, rather than the ordinary-looking Puritan folk who you would have found in Salem. So the glowing ghost of Melissa Wilcox rises from its grave at Halloween. Glowing is used frequently in early episodes of Scooby Doo. Usually the ghosts glow green, traditionally in terms of folklore an unlucky colour. And the use of phosphorescent paint is explicitly mentioned many times in these episodes as how this glowing takes place. In Which Witch is Which, a sheet is painted with phosphorus, for example, to look like the witch. In the following episode, Go Away Ghost Ship, the ghost of Redbeard the pirate, has phosphorus on his face. And in season 2, episode 1, this one at the bottom, Nowhere to Hide, great title, the ghost of Mr. Hyde, who is the great-grandson of Dr. Jekyll in terms of the show, has used phosphorescent paint. Now this was a technique that was well recorded by people in Victorian times who would go out hoaxing ghosts, who would dress as ghosts, just with the express desire to scare passers-by because it was a laugh. Now unfortunately, in Victorian times, phosphorescent paint was carcinogenic, so some of the ghost hoaxers probably came back and then did it for real later on. Back to Salem. As part of their investigation, the gang visits Salem's Witchcraft Museum, which is an actual place. There's the show's version of it and there's the actual version of it. They see on display there a set of stocks. and what Fred refers to as a dunking stool, which kind of made me think of dipping witches in a giant cup of tea. If their legs dropped off, they were unsuitable for dunking. Is she a witch? Does she weigh more than a rich tea biscuit? Also, when investigating Melissa's grave, the gang find an apotropaic mark, a protective mark, which they refer to as a witch's mark. And this bit, they've done really well, because we know that these marks were put on many buildings and other places to give magical protection from witches and other supernatural threats. In the episode, we learn that this is the sign of Mormo, which has been placed there to stop the witch from rising from the grave. Now, the writers could easily have gotten away with telling the meddling kids anything they liked in this case, but they didn't. Mormo was a female spirit in Greek folklore who acted a bit like a bogey character. Mothers and nurses would use Mormo as a threat to stop children from being naughty. The name is found with this connotation as early as the First Crusades, in fact. In etymology, it comes from a number of words which essentially boil down to the translation of fright. In modern times, it frequently refers to a female ghost or a phantom of some kind. Now, the origin isn't known for certain. I do wonder whether Momo, from the Momo Challenge, the internet viral piece of rubbish that went around a few years ago, was a kind of corrupted form of this name. The original Mormo ate her children and then flew off. Who knows? In terms of modern entertainment, Mormo crops up in other places as well, in fact, which is quite relevant to this idea in Scooby Doo. So, Lovecraft's book, The Horror at Red Hook, has an inscription in it to Hecate, Gorgo, and Mormo, for example. She's an evil witch in the movie version of Neil Gaiman's Stardust, and a flying cat in the video game Tales of the World Radiant Mythology. So kudos to the writers for actually getting this very well done. Various other iterations of witches come along in the show. Sometimes they exhibit traits that you would expect. Another ghost witch, the ghost of Witch McCoy, appears in episode 6 of season 2 of the Scooby Doo show, the Ozark Witch Switch. This time we've got tropes of turning people into frogs and the witch turning into a cat. Swamp Witch, the next one along, I won't say too much about because she appears in the second series of season 1 of Scooby Doo and him. She has the stereotypical features again, the witch's hat, the hooked nose and the cackle, and this time a magic wand. And she also has a goblin companion called Globby. That could well be a play on words from the traditional brownie or boggart known as the Dobby, which obviously went into a well-known fiction series by she who must not be named. Another witch, looking much as you would expect, comes up in episode 4B of season 2 of the same series, Scooby's House of Mystery. Often in this series, there's no unmasking of the villain at all. So here we see a sense of the supernatural characters being portrayed in the theoretical world of the marvellous rather than the uncanny. They genuinely are supernatural. The uncanny, in this case, is the fact that Scrappy's in it. Yeah. Now, it's some time before we find a witch again in an episode of a Scooby Partwork, but in 2017, in the second season of Be Cool Scooby Doo, which if you haven't watched it is hilarious, we find the character of the Slavic witch Baba Yaga making an appearance. The episode is called Halloween, and it starts off with the story that Fred won't go out with the others at Halloween because he's traditionally always failed to solve mysteries on this date. The problem, it's revealed, stretches back to when Fred was a child and went out trick-or-treating with his friends Rose and Scott. They came across an old house in the woods, but they got scared away from it by a witch. When they returned with the police, the house had mysteriously gone. Eventually, the gang persuade Fred to go out trick-or-treating. Velma has been moaning constantly about the crass commercialisation of the traditional Gaelic Halloween. So, to visualise Velma having fun, Daphne dresses up as a zombie version of Velma. Fred becomes very nervous because some of the children trick-or-treating seem to resemble some of the villains from the gang's previous investigations. Suddenly, the witch's house from when Fred was a kid appears. Shaggy and Scooby go to knock on the door for a trick-or-treat, but a witch scares them all off. Much hilarity ensues, as you would expect. The witch ends up being a woman called Mrs. Clune, who's working alongside her husband to try and end Halloween as a celebration. They fitted hydraulic chicken legs to their house. A nod to the Baba Yaga legend. And every year they go to another town, they make themselves popular, they become part of the town's neighbourhood watch, and then at Halloween they scare the bejeebus out of everybody with their flying broomstick, which is powered by mercury and copper, and their mechanical Baba Yaga house. The gang can't understand why the couple would want to end Halloween, until Velma points out that it's obvious that they, like her, can't stand the commercialism. Her evidence for this, in fact, is in Mrs. Clune's cauldron room, because it's full of the hallmarks of ancient religion and ritual. Apples, nuts, book on ancient traditions, a nice way to kind of bring the older ways into the show. Later in the same season, there's an episode called World of Witchcraft, in which the gang return to Salem. Unfortunately, it seems that the writers have still not mastered numbers, because now they state that Salem is being troubled by its first witch in 400 years. Apart from the fact they seem to have forgotten the other previous ghost witch incidents which were in Salem, they're now 100 years out again, but in the other direction. In this episode, the mayor, who happens to be a descendant of the original Salem trial judge, looks at holding new trials. Daphne ends up being the first to be accused of witchcraft, interestingly for the second time, because she was accused of this in an earlier episode of the same season, an episode called Rain Scare, which was about Renaissance fairs. The episode does in fact provide a really interesting social commentary on the persecution of women for witchcraft in our history. As they are turned upon by the pitchfork-wielding crowd, and Shaggy and Scooby are tied to stakes next to Daphne, Shaggy says, like, I can't believe these people. They pounce on the free-spirited women, but they have no problem with the guy who can eat 20 pies at once and his talking dog. I mean, if anybody here was using magic, it would be us. Now, time's getting on, but I do want to turn very briefly to Scooby Doo features, and to one in particular, which I'll end on in a minute. Witches turn up in a few of the direct-to-video and telefilm features. There's one in the really terribly, terribly gothic Scooby Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf. This is another plot which sits in the actual supernatural is supernatural end of the scale. It features all of the classic Universal monsters: Dracula, Mummy, Frankenstein's monster, vampire, a witch, and some other ones as well. The plot is really simple. Every year, all the classic monsters hold a monster road rally, kind of like wacky races with a bit more bite, to determine who will win the Monster of the Year competition. But Wolfman has retired to Florida and they need a new werewolf. It's easy to see how this went direct to video. It turns out that there's a particular type of full moon, which allows you to turn a human being into a werewolf. It only comes along once every 500 years, but, quelle surprise, it's due just about now. The monsters turn Shaggy into a werewolf and he has to win the race in order to be turned back to normal again. It's not your standard Scooby-Doo fare, and in fact the rest of the gang aren't in it at all. But it is notable for a couple of things. It's the only time, outside of the brief fling that he has with Velma, that animated Shaggy has a girlfriend. Also, an animated William Hanna appears in the film in a brief cameo, a bit like Alfred Hitchcock. But most importantly, it's the last time that Scrappy is featured in a major role until the live-action Scooby-Doo film. But the key direct-to-video feature for representations of the witch, and one which needs a little bit more focus, and so the one that I'm going to end on with a brief exploration, is this one. Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, released in 1999. Like most of the direct-to-video stories, the plot of this one sits again in the realm of the supernatural being supernatural, according to these theories. There are no villains to unmask in these stories. The supernatural is real, but justice still needs to be meted out. The story is set in the fictional New England town of Oakhaven, which has a parallel, somebody pointed out to me the last time I gave this talk, to Crowhaven in terms of folk horror. It's in the suburbs of Salem. It was said to have been founded by Puritans in the 1600s. One of the early residents of the town was Sarah Ravencroft, who was executed as a witch and whose spirit was trapped in the spell book to prevent her from returning to get her revenge on the town. In modern Oakhaven, townspeople decide to recreate Sarah's ghost, a fake version of it, to act as a tourist attraction. Mystery Incorporated are invited to Oakhaven by the famous horror author Ben Ravencroft. He's a modern ancestor of Sarah, and he's also a bit of a parody of both Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft. The gang solved the mystery of Sarah's fake ghost, but unfortunately, along with Ben, whilst doing so, they inadvertently raise her real ghost from the spellbook. Now this film actually does a lot of good towards the idea of representing the plight of women who were persecuted as witches, and it tries really, really hard to get that point across. But unfortunately it then also includes some horrendous errors which will make any witchcraft historian shudder. The plot takes pains to point out that many of Sarah's neighbours have said that she was a healer and that she was wrongly accused. She's described as having treated people under an oak tree, which was known for its healing powers. Certainly the oak is very important in terms of mythology and folklore, and there are various healing powers associated with that tree. Oak bark was used and is still used in medicine because of its antiseptic properties. It can be given instead of quinine for fevers, for example. You powder it and mix it with water. Bruised oak leaves can relieve inflammation. Thistleton Dyer's The Folklore of Plants, published in 1889, has a Germanic cure for gout, which involves the oak. It's one of the many trees which was used in charms for the transference of pain from the body. Now, Ben Ravencroft also says the same thing about his ancestor. A quote from one point being, "Unjustly persecuted, Sarah Ravencroft was a medicine woman who practiced natural healing and was unfairly accused because of her eccentric ways." Unfortunately, Ben also says that Sarah is a Wiccan who used her natural herbs to heal people. A Wiccan in the 1600s. Daphne compounds this by saying that Wiccans were people who were, quote, in tune with the forces of nature and used them for healing purposes, end quote. Velma at least explains the origin of the word witch pretty correctly. And it really is a shame that this conflation of modern Wicca with ancient healing and witchcraft practices is made, because the message that this show is trying to put across is actually a really good one, and on the whole it does it really well. As a sidebar, Ben Ravencroft is voiced by this person, who also returned to voice acting on Scooby Doo once more. In fact, twice more. Once as the titular monster in Scooby Doo and the Goblin King, and once more, does anybody know what he also did in the live-action movie? He was the voice of Scrappy in the live-action. There is one other notable set of residents of Oakhaven that I want to mention, because they went on to become very important for a lot of people in a totally unconnected way, and they are Dusk, Thorn and Luna, or if you don't recognise those names, this is the Hex Girls. Described by the writers at the time both as eco-goths, a completely made-up term which all the artists performing the Greeks laughed about at the time, and Wiccan pop goth, the Hex Girls certainly went on to make their mark on the show. A lot was made of the fact that they were Wiccan and they used particular religious persuasion as a force for good. Okay, that's fine. Sadly, the real name character of the lead singer of the group is seen as using peppermint and cloves. Sally, sorry. Sally, the real name character of the lead singer of the group, is seen to use peppermint and cloves to soothe her vocal cords. Okay? Certainly part of an old herbal remedy for toothache, and score another mark for good research. The Hex Girls took the show right back to the initial problem which caused its creation in 1969 in the first place, because conservative parent groups then complained that the film was promoting Wiccan practices. 30 years later, in 1999, it's much more easy for the show to weather that kind of storm than it was in the 60s. In fact, such was the popularity of the Hex Girls that the studio even began talks, they ultimately didn't come to fruition sadly, of spinning them off into their own show. Their image was toned down a little bit over the years, but they returned quite a few times to the Scoobyverse. They also became queer icons in the show. They highlighted an element of queer culture in the 1990s, and recently there's been an amount of viral tweetage stating that the Hex Girls were the reason that a number of people now understood their sexuality, such as this one from 2018. Now, as I'm sure you can appreciate, this talk only scratches the surface of the ways in which Scooby Doo has had a complex but ultimately fascinating relationship, which you don't really think about, with real-world folklore and popular culture and myth, and how it shapes it as well as representing it. Now, there isn't time to cover all of the interplay between non-Western traditions and fantasy and the other traditional folklore elements, but there is certainly plenty more to explore. And there's my end credit where you can contact me if you want to do so.